Hello and welcome. My name is Dan Wynn. I'm the co-founder of Nordic Horizons, think tank and campaign group. This presentation was originally written for staff at the Swedish Hemma bar in Edinburgh, following an event we had back in October 2016 called Scotland After Brexit, Lessons from the Nordics, all about what Scotland can learn from the Nordic countries and their relationship with the EU post-Brexit. So when I was writing this presentation, I discovered that really we need to understand the context of what we're talking about. So you get a 3-for-1 crash course here. You get to learn all about the Nordic countries and why we're interested in them, a bit about the EU and Brexit with a wee bit of jumping, and about our event as well. I should say, of course, that all the views expressed in this presentation are entirely my own. I take full responsibility for them. And also, if you can lay your hands on a bit of paper and a pen, that would be useful. You'll see why very soon. Okay, got that? Here we go. So Scotland After Brexit, a rather boring title. So in honour of the fact that some people seem unable to pronounce Brexit, here's poor old Andrew Davies, Tory leader in the Welsh Assembly, and the fact that this was originally written for staff at Hemma, I decided to call the presentation Hemma After Breakfast, Lessons from Hagar the Horrible. But why is it me talking to you about this? Well, because Cara, manager at Hemma, asked me to, of course. Also because staff have been asking, who's that geek on the laptop in the corner? What's he doing? Well, mostly I'm doing work for think tank Nordic Horizons. So what do I mean by Nordic? Well, the Nordic countries are... So the Nordic countries are the 3 Scandinavian countries. So that's Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, plus Finland and Iceland, which is kind of somewhere off to the left of the map here. But why are we so interested in the Nordic countries? Well, surveys suggest that Denmark is the happiest country in the world, and all 5 Nordic countries always come within the top 10 happiest countries in the world, and the top 10 countries in the world for virtually every measurement of economic, human, environmental well-being. That, I do think, deserves a skull. Introducing Hagar, the horrible mascot of Skål Swedish lager, of course. But why so happy? Is it all that Carlsberg and Skål, or is it something else? Well, here's one way to answer that question. So let's play the Rolsey and Vale game. You'll need your pen and paper for this. All I want you to do is draw a long box across the top of your piece of paper. That box represents all of society's wealth. Now split the box into 5 sections, each section representing a fifth of society's population, from the richest on the left down to the poorest on the right, and make each section as large or as small as you like to represent what share of the wealth you think each group currently has. So for example, if you thought that each fifth of society owned about a fifth of the wealth, then your table would look a little bit like this. If, on the other hand, you thought that maybe the richest 20% in society owned 40% of the wealth, then instead of putting this line here, you might put it down here. Yeah? Pause the video if you like, have a wee think about that for a second, and then we'll come back. Now draw another box, just the same. Imagine, however, this time that you're just about to be born. Now don't worry, Nordic Horizons is not some weird born-again Viking pagan cult. The point of this is that because you're just about to be born, you don't know what background or class you're going to be born into. This takes the accident of birth out of your thinking, makes it fairer, yeah? So again, each group represents one of the classes in society, richest to poorest, but only I know which one you're going to be born into. Now, split the wealth in this society according to how you think wealth should be split. Okay? Again, if you think that wealth should be distributed almost communistically, equally, a fifth of the wealth to each fifth of the population, then again your table would look like this. So how do your tables compare? Well, these figures are for the United States, but they're very similar to those for the United Kingdom. First of all, the actual distribution of wealth in both countries at the top here. And as you can see, the richest 20% of society controls something like 83, 84% of the wealth. Here's the first table you did, and this is what Americans think the distribution of wealth in society is. Yep. Here's the second table you did, and here's what 90% of Americans would like the distribution of wealth to be. I bet that looks very familiar to you. About 90% of people throughout the world who take the Rawlsian Veil test say they would like wealth to be distributed as it is in this bottom table here. So here again is the distribution of wealth for the United States. Same table, just a different color. Here is perfect equality. And here is the distribution of wealth in Sweden. Does that look familiar? I bet it does. Because 90% of people who take the Rawlsian Veil test throughout the world would like wealth to be distributed as it is in Sweden. So what if wealth is spread unequally? Why does it matter? Well, this graph plots income inequality versus health and social problems. These problems include ones around life expectancy, maths and literacy, crime, health, drug and alcohol addiction, social mobility, i.e. if you're born poor, do you stay poor or can you work your way out of poverty? And what you notice is that countries with high income inequality, that's the biggest gap between rich and poor, such as the US, also do the worst for social problems. Whereas countries down at this end of the graph with low income inequality, that's the smallest gap between the rich and poor, also do a lot better for social problems. And they include Japan, for example, but also the Nordic countries. And look where poor Scotland is as part of the UK up here. Big gap between rich and poor and also high social problems. That might explain why we Scots have occasionally a reputation for being slightly grumpy. So, how do the Nordic countries do it? Well, there is such a thing as the Nordic Model. And here she is. But just before you think I'm being sexist, of course, the Nordic countries are leaders in the world for gender equality. So here's another Nordic model. But sorry everyone, actually, the Nordic supermodel we're really interested in is this guy here, and what a fine specimen he is. But what is the Nordic model really? Well, there are many reasons to be cheerful if you're Nordic, because the Nordic model could be described like this. High wages, great working conditions, workers' control of their workplaces, fairer taxes, generous welfare benefits for everyone, including the middle classes and rich, and so they don't mind so much paying the slightly higher, fairer taxes because they all benefit too, and free, very high quality public services, again for everyone. Everyone benefits and therefore everyone doesn't mind so much paying in. Some other key aspects of the Nordic model. I've mentioned equality for women. This is Helga, Hagar's wife. She has benefited from a very strong feminist movement, which has led to more women in the Nordic countries being in full-time, high-paid work. This gives women more independence and a higher status. And of course, having more women in the workforce leads to increased productivity, which is great for the economy as a whole. One of the ways the Nordic countries has achieved this is through free or subsidised high quality childcare and social services which are designed to support women in the workplace. Nordic countries are famed for being child-centred.
Yay!
This is Hagar's son Hamlet. He will have benefited from a very high quality education, especially if he grew up in Finland. Much of the Nordic education system is play-based learning outside in nature. It's a much more natural way for kids to learn, it's far healthier, and kids develop a much more positive relationship with the environment as a result. Again, how have the Nordic countries achieved this? Well, high, generous child benefits for everyone and generous parental leave, including for fathers. That means that dads are more likely to be involved in family life, which has all sorts of positive benefits. An ethical foreign policy. So, for example, Sweden, per head of population, is currently taking the highest number of Syrian refugees of any country in the world. Also, if you want a moderator to solve an international conflict, then you can do no better than to bring in a negotiator from one of the Nordic countries, famed for this throughout the world. Environmentalism. The Nordic countries lead the world in recycling, renewable energy, and all sorts of other environmental policies. So this is where Nordic Horizons comes in. So what is Nordic Horizons? Well, we're a voluntary think tank and campaign group, and we were set up in 2010 by myself and Leslie Riddick. That's her there. Leslie is a journalist, currently a Scotsman columnist. And our thinking is that we would like Scotland and the UK to be a little bit more like the Nordics. We share culture with them, history, language, a bit of politics. They're right next door and they're the best countries in the world, so why wouldn't we? We hold about 6 events a year, mainly at the Scottish Parliament, and we bring across Nordic experts to talk to us about all sorts of issues which we think we could learn something from. We've held events on things like Brexit, climate change, education, how to do trams, defence, welfare, immigration, childcare, you name it. We web stream and record all our events so you can see them again on our website. That includes video interviews with our speakers. And we run a Facebook group with about 2,500 members, so please do join. We'll come back to the Nordic model later, but for now, let's have a look at the EU. So what's the EU anywho? Well, I like to think of the EU as one giant Sesame Street. It's the best example of international cooperation in history, and its motto, I think, could be make lots of lolly, but share nicely. It's a loose deal between the left and the right. It's social democracy, a capitalist economy with a socialistic kind of society, wealth being used for the benefit of all, at least in its purest form. Some EU countries are on the left of this deal, like the Nordics, for example, with their own Nordic model of social democracy, and other countries are more on the conservative right of this deal, such as the UK. So economically, we get the single market, or the European Economic Area. The idea behind this is to have as few rules, regulations, or barriers to trade as possible to help the economy grow and to create a bigger pie. So most EU countries are in the customs union, so there's no import taxes to sell goods and services across EU borders. And some EU countries are in the euro, that's the single currency, which again makes trading more efficient and leads to a bigger pie. For the left, what we get is a fairer sharing of that bigger pie through social protections. So what do I mean by social protections, or what's the EU ever done for moi? Well, workers' rights, minimum pay, breaks at work, holiday entitlement, etc., etc. Sunshine and socialism. You have the right to travel, study and retire in any more sunny or more lefty EU country. And let's face it, for us that means pretty much any of them. Free movement. That's migration within the EU. Now, it's not completely free, in fact. There are rules, although in the Schengen area, which some countries are members of, there are fewer rules, but there are rules. Free movement is designed to increase the efficiency of the economy again. People go where the jobs are and where people aren't. So, for example, Britain really does benefit greatly from EU doctors coming to work here. Also, immigrants are more likely to do jobs that the natives, if you like, are less likely to do. And countries like the UK, which have a severe shortage of young people, really do benefit from younger people coming in from other EU countries, for example, to work in our hospitality industry. Now, there are occasionally problems with immigration, but they tend to occur where migrants are forced into deprived areas where there's a shortage of jobs, housing, and services, and then they end up competing with the local population for those jobs, houses, and services. The solution, though, of course, is to make sure that there's the right investment in these areas so that there are enough jobs, houses, and services. Yeah? And that way, everyone can benefit directly from the extra productivity that migrants bring to the economy. The evidence is that overall, everyone does benefit in the end from immigration. Now, here's a crucial point. You have the right to be an immigrant too. How many people from other EU countries do you think live and work in the UK? You might be surprised to learn that it's as low as 2.5 to 3 million. Remember, Britain has a population of 60 million people. Only 2.5 to 3 million of them are from other EU countries. And look at it the other way, how many British people live and work in other EU countries? You might be surprised to learn it's as high as 2 million. So all this fuss about EU immigration is down to a net difference of about 0.5 to 1 million people. That's all. Imagine you're at a party and there are 59 people at that party. One more person walks in to make it 60. Is that party suddenly overcrowded? No, I don't think so. The EU is also designed to bring people closer. A closer union of the people. So people make friends, not war. This is a crucial point. Europe has almost always been at war with itself. We have had the longest peace ever since the EU was created. We should never ever take that for granted. The EU also keeps us stronger against potential aggressors from other parts of the world, but more on that later. So what are these guys all about? Well, the right wants to ditch the social protections that the EU gives us. Why? Because they cost money, tax money, and they'd rather reduce taxes, especially on themselves, of course. The right wants to break the EU deal and destroy social democracy, especially the most left-wing version, the Nordic model of social democracy. And it's not just the European right that wants to do this, like Nigel Farage. Trump has allegedly said he would like to, quote, nuke Denmark, the happiest country in the world. As you can imagine, that did not please the Danes too much. Still in America, Democrats have brought the Nordic model into the battle too. Socialism that works, Bernie Sanders has described the Nordic model. Bernie Sanders obviously nearly was chosen by the Democrats to stand against Trump and probably would have beaten Trump if the Democrats had chosen him. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia is getting more aggressive, threatening obviously the Ukraine, but also the Baltic states and Poland too. Trump and Russian leader Putin want the EU to fall apart because they're both right-wing populists who want to take away social protections. They both love Brexit. So we're in a global battle of ideas about how societies should be. European social democracy, especially the Nordic version, is at the centre of that battle. And that is the real context of Brexit. So if the Rawlsian veil test shows that most people want a distribution of wealth like Sweden, why did the poorest 40% in the UK vote for Brexit, and why did the poorest 40% in the US vote for Trump? These votes obviously threaten their own social protections. Well, the right got their votes using the oldest trick in the book. Divide and rule. So the UK voted to leave the EU. But where are we going now? It would appear that the winds are blowing us towards America. The battle at the moment seems to be over hard versus soft Brexit. So here's Theresa May, British Prime Minister, and Angela Merkel, German Chancellor, battling it out. Soft-boiled Brexit or hard-boiled Brexit? Sorry, guys. Hard Brexit is supported by right-wing Tories, including the UK government and the UK Independence Party, and they want to get as far away as possible from the EU to ditch as many social protections as they can. They want to become more like the US. Remember the graph showing the US as having the highest social problems? Yep, exactly. Soft Brexit, on the other hand, is supported by Labour, Lib Dems, SNP, moderate Tories, etc., as being the next best thing to full EU membership, and they would obviously like to keep Britain in the EU if that becomes possible at all. They're worried that trade deals with the EU could take years and might not be very good for the UK. The UK probably needs the EU a lot more than the EU needs the UK. So they want to stay in the single market or the European Economic Area. They do accept some limits on free movement of people, although not all of them agree on that. And importantly, they want to keep as many social and environmental protections as possible. Now, most of these parties felt compelled to accept the result of the referendum and to accept that we are leaving the EU. But they feel that through the Great Repeal Act, which is the legislation which will take the UK out of the EU, they can force the UK government into a soft Brexit rather than a hard Brexit. And that would seem to reflect the popular vote. It was a very narrow vote to leave the EU after all. Our rights as citizens may depend on their success. So what about Scotland? Could Scotland stay in the UK and stay in the EU even if the rest of the UK leaves the EU? Or to stay in the EU, would we need to leave the UK? Would we want to be in the EU but not in the UK? After all, some people point out that 80% of our trade is with England. And would the EU let an independent Scotland join? Well, here's Juncker, President of the EU Commission, very friendly to the Scots. On the other hand, perhaps France and Spain would veto our membership because they wouldn't want to encourage some of their regions like Catalonia or the Basque Country to go independent, thinking they could then rejoin the EU as Scotland had. So it's quite complicated. So now we understand the Nordic model and the EU, the question is, if we want to be in the EU and follow a Nordic social democratic model post-Brexit, what can we learn from the Nordic countries? Well, to answer that, Nordic Horizons held a conference on the 29th of October 2016 to look at the question of Scotland after Brexit, lessons from the Nordics. And here are our speakers. From left to right, Professor Mary Hilson, Aarhus University, Denmark, Jon Balvid Hannibalsson, ex-leader of Iceland's Social Democratic Party, Björt Samuelson, MP in the Faroese Parliament, Dr. Duncan Halley, Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, Ulrik Pramgad from the University of Aalborg, Denmark, and Thomas Isumarku from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I'm glad to say that our conference was very well attended. Over 300 people came along, including Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs. Now, the 5 Nordic countries have very different relationships to the EU. Leslie calls this the Nordic hokey cokey. Some are in, some are out, and some are shaking it all about. So I will start with the most simple example, and they get more interesting and complex as we go on. I should point out this is my interpretation of what the speakers said, and I've picked out what I think are the salient points. Finland has a population of about 4 million people. It's probably the most pro-EU of all the Nordic countries. It's also the only Nordic country to be a member of the single currency, the euro. It's also in the Schengen area of very free movement of people. Now, the UK is Finland's major trading partner, and for that reason, Finland is pretty devastated by Brexit. But Finland's priority is security. It shares a very long eastern border with Russia. Its priority is defence. It's very worried by a weakening EU and a weakening NATO by Brexit and Trump. And so Finland's advice to Scotland might be to try to become a full EU member and particularly to play a full part in defence. Sweden has a population of about 10 million. It's very pro-European, but unlike Finland, it is not in the single currency, the euro. The lesson here is that contrary to what many Brexiteers say, a small country like Scotland might be able to join the EU but opt out of the euro and other things that we're not sure about. The EU is actually very flexible. I've put Norway and Iceland together because they have very similar relationships with the EU. So Norway has a population of about 4 million and Iceland has a population of about 0.5 million. Now, neither of them are actually in the EU, but both of them are in the European Economic Area, along with Liechtenstein. That means they're both in the single market, they both have free movement of people, but neither of them are in the single currency, the euro, and the reason why they don't qualify for full EU membership is that neither of them are in the Common Agricultural Policy or the Common Fisheries Policy. Now, no one denies that there is a problem with the Common Fisheries Policy. Essentially, it gives each EU member state access to other EU member states' waters to fish, and that increases competition. But the problem is not too much EU, the problem is too little, because individual governments can ignore the EU's advice on how many fish to take from the seas. That leads to overfishing and a collapse in stocks. Now, Norway and Iceland want Scotland to manage the fish stocks of the North Sea with them. That means us joining the EEA with them, but not the EU, so that we can stay out of the Common Fisheries Policy. However, they've said that they do not want us to bring England with us. England is too big, it would dominate the small EEA countries, and probably make the EEA a little bit too right-wing and anti-EU. There is, however, a downside to EEA membership. Norway is often described as having a relationship with the EU of directive by fax. What this means is that because Norway and Iceland are in the EEA, they must stick to the rules of the single market, which are set by the EU countries, and they have no say over those rules. They have no members of the European Parliament or commissioners to put their point of view. Denmark, which includes the territories of Greenland and the Faroe Islands, has a population of about 4 million. And although it is in the EU, it does kind of the Nordic hokey cokey. This is Hagar's mate, Lucky Eddie, and that's because Greenland and the Faroe Islands are not in the EU. They have what's called a territorial exemption, and that's because they do not want to be members of the Common Fisheries Policy. They have very large fishing industries. This has led to many people suggesting that Scotland and the UK could do what's called a reverse Greenland. Essentially, the UK would stay in the EU, but England and Wales would get a territorial exemption from EU rules. Ulrich Pramgad calls this Engwexit, and there could be no veto by Spain or France over Scotland's membership of the EU because we would never have left the EU. More proof again that actually the EU is very flexible. However, would the UK allow this? Would England be okay with just a territorial exemption from the EU? Would Brussels allow this kind of arrangement? If not, could we do this ourselves through getting control over foreign affairs, either through devolution, federalism, or some kind of independence, perhaps? The other lesson from Denmark and the Faroe Islands and Greenland is not to just wait and see what happens, but decide what we want and go for it. So, What are the lessons from the Nordic countries' relationships with the EU for Scotland post-Brexit? Firstly, there's a range of relationships with the EU that can work and which are compatible with Nordic social democracy, including full membership like Finland, almost full membership like Sweden, which is not in the euro, European Economic Area membership like Norway and Iceland, or EU membership with territorial exemptions like Denmark. Reverse Greenland is hypothetically possible, although the UK government does not seem interested in any deals to keep Scotland in the EU or to have a closer relationship to the EU than the rest of the UK. That might change in time. Thirdly, various alliances with Nordic countries are possible. For example, full EU membership might keep us closer to Finland and Sweden over things like defence, and EEA membership might keep us closer to Norway and Iceland. That might set up a little bit of a tug of love between England and Norway, or the UK and the EEA. And of course, there's Hagar. Rather than coming to raid us, he's showing his love for us by coming to drink some whiskey and play some golf. But of course, Scotland has been invited by the EEA, Iceland and Norway, to join the EEA, but not to bring England with us. But soft Brexit, which is what the UK opposition parties are trying to achieve, is kind of that. It is very similar to an EEA relationship with the EU. That might cause some problems further down the line. I'm still optimistic that Scotland, whatever its relationship to the rest of the UK, could still stay in the single market at least post-Brexit, perhaps through some kind of reverse Greenland deal. And whether we're full members of the EU or of the EEA, I think that a new Nordic social democratic bloc, including Scotland, is possible, because one thing at least seems likely, that the Nordic countries would welcome a closer relationship to Scotland with open arms. Could we be one big happy post-Brexit Nordic social democratic family? Maybe, but only if enough of us understand that the option is there. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed that. If you're interested in more information from our conference on Brexit, then we have actually produced a book called McSmorgasbord, available from all good bookstores, of course. And please do join our Facebook group. You'll find all sorts of interesting chats and information on there, including about our forthcoming events. And I hope I will see you at one of them. Thank you so much and take care for now.